In the quiet small town of Lowell, Maine, the elderly boarding house landlady of Hearth Haven on Maple Street 17 was a model of mercy and care for the locals. But the reality was far more sinister. Under the blooming flower beds of her cozy courtyard, the police discovered terrible secrets. Those to whom she had promised rescue and help were never seen again, but their social welfare checks continued to arrive regularly in her account. The 15th of May 2020 was cloudy and cold, even by Maine state standards. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the loud noise of a working excavator sounded on Maple Street, a small and quiet street in the small town of Lowell. The work was taking place behind the Hearth Haven boarding house, known to locals as a refuge for those who stood on the edge of life. Homeless people, elderly people, addicts. This house, painted in pale green with neat white shutters, always seemed to the locals to be an island of good and peace. Its owner, an elderly woman, was considered a model of virtue and compassion. But on this May Day, the reputation of the boarding house was forever shaken. Sheriff Michael Graves of Lowell County appeared at exactly 25 minutes past 6 in the morning at Hearth Haven. He had been called by the foreman who had dug a trench for laying new utility lines. When the metal shovel penetrated the earth again, it became obvious. A human hand protruded from the dirt and sand. The summoned crime scene technician officially documented the find. The remains recovered from the earth belonged to a man of about 57 years. His name, as it later turned out, was James Martin. Just recently, he had been registered as a resident of the boarding house. When exactly James had disappeared, no one could say, including the house owner. The reason why Martin's life came to an end was unclear at this point. From this moment on, the sheriff faced a central question that had to be answered at any cost. How had the boarding house guest been buried behind the walls of the boarding house that should have been his salvation? By evening of the same day, after the first hours of work by the crime scene technicians, strange details began to emerge, each of which complicated the situation. A thorough examination of the discovery site led to the conclusion that the remains had been in the earth for at least 1 month. Some areas of James Martin's body were partially mummified, which indicated his longer stay in dry and loose earth that the house owner actively used as a garden. Questioning the neighbors revealed another important fragment. 2 residents of the nearest houses claimed to have sensed something unpleasant coming from the boarding house area throughout the spring. They described the smell as sweet and unbearable. They even complained to the house owner herself, but she claimed the cause lay in fertilizers, and the neighbors stopped insisting. When searching the room where James Martin had lived, the police found an empty bottle of phenobarbital, a strong sedative that was strictly prescription. Its presence with a man who did not suffer from serious illnesses seemed suspicious. The last strange moment was the registration book of boarding house residents. The owner fundamentally used no computer and recorded the entry and exit of guests only on paper. The entry that James had allegedly left the boarding house had been made with a pen, but the date and signature were strangely blurred by moisture and had become illegible. Whether this was coincidence or a deliberate attempt to erase traces was still unclear. Around the quiet and once cozy boarding house, a wave of suspicion arose. The residents of Lowell began to look around mistrustfully. One of the first to draw police attention was a neighbor named Robert Crane. Crane, a man around 60, had long been in conflict with the boarding house owner. The reason was the land next to the house that Crane dreamed of taking for a parking lot for his auto shop. In the town, it was known that the dispute between them had been going on for not the first year, but previously it had been perceived only as a domestic trifle. Another suspect became the boarding house medical attendant, Neil Boston, who had recently turned 30. It was he who had access to all the boarding house medications. It was also known that Boston had regularly complained to colleagues about salary delays in recent months. In a small town, rumors spread easily, so it soon became known to everyone that he had serious financial problems and large credit debts. This was enough for the police to begin studying his biography and circle of acquaintances closely. Everything was complicated by Robert Crane himself when he voluntarily gave an interview to the local newspaper on the evening of the same day. He explained to journalists that he had repeatedly seen the medical attendant Boston putting syringes in his pockets and allegedly mixing something into the boarding house residents' food. The information seemed frightening and logical at the same time. In the boarding house were defenseless people who could easily become victims of any evildoer. Crane's statement spread quickly in the town and caused resonance among the locals. However, the police could not completely trust the neighbors' words at this point. After all, Crane's motive was obvious. Personal dislike could push him to inventions. But the police were forced to accept his statements and check this version. Late in the evening, the situation changed fundamentally. During the continuation of excavations, literally a few meters from the first discovery site, the crime scene technician made another discovery. This time they pulled a shin bone from the earth that already belonged to another victim, a woman. It was buried much deeper, which indicated that the crime had happened long before the case with James. The boarding house was immediately cordoned off. The excavations were stopped, and an official court order was required for continuing the investigation. Now, no one could say how many remains were still hidden under the peaceful appearance of the well-maintained courtyard of the Hearth Haven boarding house. Within the next few hours, all of Lowell froze in anxious expectation and understood that the quiet Maple Street would never be the same again. Why does Crane so persistently accuse Neil Boston, the medical attendant from the boarding house? Sheriff Michael Graves sat across from Robert Crane again, the owner of the local auto shop. The office smelled of old machine oil, gasoline, and long unwashed work clothes. Crane was visibly nervous and kept clenching and unclenching his fists. He was already accustomed to police visits, but this time the circumstances seemed more serious than usual. In the last 2 days, Robert Crane's version about the medical attendant Boston allegedly mixing something into the boarding house residents' food with the help of syringes had been completely refuted. The expertise proved that the syringes that Crane allegedly saw were ordinary disposable pastry bags from the boarding house kitchen. Now the police seriously took on Crane himself and tried to understand why the man so persistently strived to accuse an employee of Hearth Haven. The sheriff understood. There had to be a motive, and soon it began to surface, like all other unpleasant secrets on Maple Street. When searching through the papers kept at the local police station, Sheriff Graves discovered not 1, but 4 complaints from Robert Crane, filed from 2018 to 2020. All complaints said the same thing: strange smells coming from the boarding house area. Robert insisted that the residents were polluting soil and air, which negatively affected the business and reputation of his auto shop. But it was strange that after checking the complaints by the city health services, no violations were found. Then, in 1919, Crane, tired of the useless checks, even dared to file a lawsuit against the boarding house owner. In court, he tried to prove that Hearth Haven was a source of groundwater and soil pollution. However, the judge, after examining the case, dismissed the lawsuit due to insufficient evidence. The again losing and humiliated Crane was silent for a while, but his dislike for the boarding house owner and her residents became obvious to everyone. And only now, when the police investigated the financial situation of the auto shop, did the true motive of such an angry and unyielding struggle become clear. The tax office of Maine State shared unpleasant news with the investigators. Crane's auto shop was rapidly heading toward bankruptcy. In recent years, his debts had exceeded profits many times over. There were fewer and fewer customers. The equipment was outdated. The only possibility for Robert to save the business was the land belonging to the boarding house. Only by expanding the territory and creating a convenient parking lot could Crane hope to attract new customers and stabilize income. Now it was understandable why Crane tried with such persistence to get rid of the neighbor and her boarding house. However, the main question remained: Could Robert Crane have been physically involved in the incident with James Martin and other still unknown victims? The police officers carefully checked Crane's alibi for the night from the 10th to the 11th of May, when James Martin presumably disappeared. According to the documents provided by Crane himself, he was on work duty that night. This was confirmed by delivery receipts for antifreeze signed by himself and entries in the warehouse journal. In addition, a warehouse employee questioned under oath confirmed Crane's words and assured that he had indeed spent the entire night at the workplace. The sheriff personally checked the warehouse's video surveillance recordings. No contradictions were found. Robert Crane's alibi was rock solid. After the confirmation of the alibi, the version of Robert Crane as the physical perpetrator fell away completely. But nevertheless, the motive connected with the land remained on the surface. The notorious syringes were only an attempt by Crane to lead the investigation on a false trail and also to blacken the reputation of the pension. But the police quickly saw through this trick, and the version with the pastry bags was officially closed and set aside. Meanwhile, unexpected details emerged in the case. A local funeral director approached the sheriff, who remembered that the pension owner had already personally ordered 5 wooden coffins from him in 2018. A special condition of the order was absolute anonymity. It seemed strange to the undertaker that in the following 2 years, no cremation certificates for these coffins appeared in the city archives. This meant that these people were not officially considered deceased, and thus the police were now forced to seriously consider the question of recording those who had once lived in the pension, but according to documents had moved out from there. The focus of the investigation shifted from Robert Crane, who was currently excluded from suspicions, to a completely different, more important task: to restore the exact list of those who really left Hearth Haven and those who simply disappeared. Robert Crane's auto repair shop temporarily fell out of the police's field of view, but for the residents of Maple Street, he forever became a reminder of how distant sometimes a person is from the image he creates for himself. How did it happen that the pension of the deceased James Martin continued to be received after his disappearance? Chief Investigator Michael Graves stood at his desk and studied the papers that the assistant had just brought from the county pension department. The same number appeared on the sheets: $780 monthly. Exactly that much was received by James Martin, that 57-year-old man whose remains had been found in the yard of the Hearth Haven pension. The papers clearly showed that James's social card remained active even after his presumed disappearance. Graves directed an official inquiry to the bank that managed James Martin's account and received an answer within just a few hours. The pension payments came regularly, and then, every month, like clockwork, someone came to the bank and collected the cash through the teller without using the ATM. Already on the same day, a search warrant for the Hearth Haven pension was obtained. In the presence of the owner, the investigators carefully examined the papers and documents that were kept in her personal work desk. One of the findings drew particular attention: a power of attorney for cash withdrawal issued in the name of James Martin and dated the 12th of March of the current year. The signature was uncertain and shaky, as if the one who made it was not feeling well or was under strong stress. The owner explained the appearance of the document calmly, without showing nervousness. James asked me to collect his money at the bank. He had health problems. It was difficult for him to walk, and the money was needed for medications. However, the owner's words did not match in any way with other documents that lay on the same table. A medication bill from the same March amounted to only $12. No other prescriptions or medical receipts were found. The police documented this fact, but did not immediately raise accusations. The suspicion, although serious, still required confirmation. To check who exactly collected James's pension from the bank, the investigators called the cashier for questioning. The girl was young, but attentive. She clearly remembered that every month the money was collected by the same elderly woman who came to the bank strictly at the same time. In the morning, exactly at 10. A special feature that the cashier remembered was a large hat that almost completely hid the face. The elderly woman always thanked politely and left quickly. The investigator questioned the pension owner again and presented her with the cashier's description. The woman admitted the fact of cash withdrawal without trying to deny the obvious. I indeed collected the money. I did this exclusively at James's request, and everything else that remained after buying medications I spent on food and daily necessities for James himself and other pension residents. This version looked plausible until the police began checking the store receipts. It turned out that all products for the pension were indeed bought regularly, but always paid for with a completely different card that was personally issued to the owner, not to James Martin. The financial operations on his account did not match any of the purchases indicated by the owner. At this moment, the pension orderly, Neil Boston, suddenly claimed to the police that he too had allegedly withdrawn money from James's card, but exclusively for buying products and necessary things. However, checking his words produced a clear result. All receipts from the store completely excluded this version, as they only matched the pension owner's personal card. Boston's version seemed incredible. However, the police postponed it for now until complete verification. The police carefully studied the cashier's records and established that Neil Boston's words did not correspond to the truth. All purchases for the pension were strictly documented and made from the owner's personal account. James Martin's card was never used in grocery stores. Now the pension orderly remained under suspicion, but his statements proved to be only a false diversionary maneuver at this time. When investigator Graves presented a photo of the pension owner to the bank cashier for official identification, the girl confirmed without hesitation, "Yes, that's definitely her. I recognized her eyes and the way she holds her head." However, there were no other witnesses in the bank who confirmed her words. One identification alone, even if it was so clear and certain, was not enough to bring official charges. The investigators understood that the isolated case with James Martin could only be part of a larger scheme. Therefore, they requested from the bank and the county notary chamber the complete chronology of all powers of attorney that had been issued by pension residents in the last 5 years. The investigation prepared to carefully study the paper trail of everyone who had once lived under the roof of the pension and disappeared, leaving behind nothing but regular financial receipts to someone's account. The investigation gently moved into a phase where behind every signature, every document stood living people whose fates were closely intertwined with the quiet and now already gloomy house on Maple Street. What liquid flows in the drainage ditch from the pension territory? Early in the morning of the 20th of May, a call came into the station. John Andrews, a local farmer and owner of house number 15 on Maple Street, reported to Sheriff Michael Graves a new oddity at the Hearth Haven pension. Andrews, a man around 60, usually kept to himself, but this time he was visibly disturbed. He insisted on an urgent meeting at his home. When Graves arrived, the farmer wordlessly led him to the backyard. Standing in front of a wooden fence, Andrews pointed to a long and narrow ditch that separated his property from the pension's garden. At the bottom of the ditch slowly flowed a murky liquid of yellow color that emitted a weak but extremely unpleasant odor. Even from a distance, it was visible that the grass around the ditch had lost its green color and had become withered and lifeless. Farmer John Andrews, a man around 60, explained to investigator Graves that initially he had not attached particular importance to the strange liquid in the ditch. He thought the neighbor on the property was using ordinary garden chemicals that periodically reached his territory. But when he noticed that the grass around the ditch literally died within a few days, he understood. This is not about fertilizers. Andrews did not want to get involved in unpleasantness, but decided that he could no longer remain silent about this. Graves carefully examined the ditch and took samples of the liquid. Already after a few hours, the county laboratory communicated the result. The yellow brew contained traces of phenobarbital, a powerful sedative that had previously been found in James Martin's room, as well as sodium nitrate, a substance used as a preservative, but which can also slow decomposition processes. These results immediately led to a new wave of questions that the sheriff wanted to ask the pension owner immediately. The owner calmly let the sheriff and crime technicians onto the pension grounds and showed not the slightest unease. Graves immediately went to the garden and discovered several unmarked plastic barrels at the fence, filled with the same yellow liquid. He asked the owner what was inside them. The answer was quick and clear. "That is my personal fertilizer. I have been preparing it myself for several years. It works excellently for roses and other plants. There is nothing criminal here." When the sheriff asked why the fertilizer was flowing beyond the boundaries of her property, the owner shrugged and answered that it was an oversight, and she had not noticed the leak. Neil Boston, the pension orderly, was also questioned about the strange liquid, but his answer proved to be quite evasive. "I am not a gardener and do not deal with the garden. I only take care of the residents and help with household tasks. What is in those barrels? I have not even been interested in that." The investigation paused for a moment at a new hypothesis. The police developed the suspicion that the orderly Boston might have used strong substances for washing medical instruments, after which he disposed of the remains in the ditch. That could have explained the presence of phenobarbital in the water samples. However, it soon turned out that the orderly never had direct access to phenobarbital in significant quantities that would suffice for such manipulations. The pension did not have the necessary medical equipment, and medical cabinets with full treatment rooms were completely absent. The investigation postponed this version as unconfirmed, but did not completely exclude it, and left the orderly Boston under close observation. However, the investigation already received unexpected information on the evening of the same day. A local plumber came to the station and handed over to the sheriff copies of bills for services that had been provided to the pension Hearth Haven. Upon careful examination of the papers, the investigator noticed a peculiarity. Over the course of the last year, the owner had twice ordered the disposal of medical waste, although the pension had neither a license nor permission for this. When the plumber asked what waste exactly needed to be disposed of, the owner answered evasively and called it old junk and medications. The plumber could not provide more detailed information. This new fact gave no direct evidence against the owner, but directed the investigation back onto a disturbing route that required immediate attention. Now the police decided to carefully check the pension's pharmacy purchases, hoping to discover the source of phenobarbital and other medications that could become a key link in the case. The investigators sent inquiries to all pharmacies in the city and county to obtain complete lists of medications acquired by Hearth Haven in recent years. While the police waited for the results of these checks, the detectives' attention focused more and more on those who had remained in the shadows until now, on residents, witnesses, neighbors, each of whom could keep secrets no less terrible than those already known to the police. Farmer John Andrews decided to stay in the background for now. However, his testimony had already played an important role in the course of the investigations. He remained in the shadows, but precisely his signal helped the police uncover the strange liquid that was obviously connected with the pension's secrets. Why did the orderly Neil Boston keep 5 foreign pension cards with him? Early in the morning of the 22nd of May, the investigators were back at the pension. This time, a safe in the staff room that the orderly Neil Boston used drew their attention. The police had obtained a search warrant after the strange information about the withdrawal of pensions from James Martin and other residents had become known. The safe proved to be old, metallic, with a number lock that was installed directly on the floor in the corner of the room. However, the investigators did not have to try the combination for long. It was locked with the banal combination 1, 2, 3, 4. Inside lay a stack of documents, and what particularly interested the investigation, 5 pension plastic cards without any PIN codes. Neil Boston, who had already come into the police's sights before, observed the search calmly. When asked where he had gotten these cards, he did not evade the answer and explained that the cards had been given to him by the pension owner. According to her words, the cards should be placed in the safe for reporting. What this was necessary for, The orderly did not specify and only claimed that he had attached no significance to it and had simply followed the owner's instructions. Despite the strangeness of the situation, the police needed more than just Boston's words to fully understand his role in what had happened. The investigators quickly switched to checking Neil Boston's alibi for the night of James Martin's disappearance, the 10th of May. According to Boston's own statements, he was not at the pension that night. Instead, the orderly spent the night at his mother's, an elderly woman who was completely bedridden due to her health condition. Boston presented to the investigator an old notebook in which he daily recorded the time of caring for his mother, and the entry from the 10th of May was actually there, made by his hand and signed. The investigators immediately directed an inquiry to the county ambulance service to confirm or refute this information. In response to the inquiry came an official document. An emergency medical technician confirmed that Neil Boston had indeed visited his mother on the evening of the 10th of May. In the ambulance service's duty log was a note about his presence which left no doubt. Boston's alibi was solid and completely confirmed. However, despite the obvious evidence of Boston's innocence, the local county newspaper published an article with the provocative headline, "Orderly Poisoner." The authors of the material claimed without particular evidence that Neil Boston might have been involved in the tragedy at the pension and the manipulations with pension payments. The publication caused strong social resonance and pressure on the police. The investigation questioned Boston again, this time more intensively. However, checking his statements revealed no contradictions. Finally, it became clear that the newspaper sensation was nothing more than an attempt to capture readers' attention, and the orderly had been chosen as a convenient target. The version presented by the newspaper was officially rejected by the police. The false trail connected with Boston was definitively closed and removed from consideration. On the same morning, after closing the case regarding Boston, the crime technicians examined yet another detail that at first glance was inconspicuous and meaningless. In the shed located on the pension grounds, an ordinary garden shovel was found. The forensic examination revealed traces of DNA epithelium from the pension owner on its wooden handle. In addition, they discovered on the handle a layer of arthritis cream that the owner regularly used. This fact unexpectedly changed the vector of the investigation. Neil Boston, who had previously been considered as a potential criminal, now received the status of a key witness who could help clarify the details of what had happened at the pension. How many victims exactly did the garden behind the pension conceal? The morning of the 24th of May greeted the residents of Maple Street with disturbing silence and police barriers surrounding the areas around the pension Hearth Haven. The investigation returned once again to the house grounds. But now, already with a professional search dog and a special spade probe for scanning the ground, the work began precisely at 8 o'clock in the morning. First, the dog, trained to find human remains, went over the area of the backyard and garden. It began almost immediately to mark spots. There turned out to be many more than even the most pessimistic police officers could have suspected. In total, the dog and equipment showed 12 separate anomalies at a depth of about 70 centimeters. After official documentation of each spot, the crime technicians began carefully opening the ground. In almost every anomaly, they found what they had expected: carefully hidden human remains. But an even more shocking discovery was small packages hidden next to the bones. In each was a passport wrapped in polyethylene. The documents belonged to pension residents who were officially considered missing in the period from 2017 to 2019. The investigators immediately directed an inquiry to the county pension department to check the status of all found documents and obtain information about financial operations. The answer received on the same day was another confirmation of the terrible scheme. Pensions and social benefits continued to come to the accounts of 11 of the 12 disappeared people. Further checking revealed that in all cases the payments were withdrawn in cash through the bank by powers of attorney. These powers of attorney were carefully examined by handwriting experts. Style and peculiarities of the signatures testified clearly. All 12 powers of attorney had been signed by one hand, and it belonged to a woman. For obvious reasons, the pension owner became the main suspect. To exclude the slightest doubt, the investigators also considered other versions. For example, they suspected that the pension orderly Neil Boston might have forged signatures, since his work contract allowed him to sign some documents on behalf of the residents. However, after careful analysis of Boston's handwriting, the experts came to a clear conclusion. The orderly had no relationship whatsoever to the found powers of attorney. The signatures were made by a female hand. The character of the writing differed from the masculine and could in no way belong to Boston. Thus, the version about the paramedics' involvement was completely refuted and officially closed by the investigation. The version about possible signature forgery by the paramedic was definitively rejected after the clear conclusions of the expertise. The investigators accepted the official conclusion of the handwriting expert and excluded Neil Boston from the suspects in the financial machinations. He remained a key witness, but no longer a suspect. The key moment of the day was the discovery by the forensic technicians on one of the passports. In the process of laboratory analysis, a greasy, clear thumbprint was discovered on the envelope of the document. The experts immediately compared it with the samples from the pension owner that had been taken earlier for conducting the expertise. The similarity was absolute, matching 12 out of 12 control points, which completely excluded coincidence. The owner's fingerprint on the passport became the first direct piece of evidence that clearly connected her with the crimes. This discovery allowed the investigators to proceed to decisive actions. That same evening, the police received arrest warrant number 145/2020 for the detention of the pension owner for conducting an official interrogation. At the same time, the investigators confiscated all financial documents, accounting books, powers of attorney, and receipts that could shed light on the true scope and mechanism of the crimes. The search and confiscation of financial documentation took place in the presence of witnesses. And despite her attempts to explain the discovered documents as ordinary financial activity, the investigators already knew that exactly she was behind the entire system of theft of benefits and pensions. Now the investigation faced the task of not only proving the owner's involvement in the financial crimes, but also establishing the exact number of her victims who were hidden under the well-tended flower beds and garden plots. It became clear that the crime had a much larger scope than initially suspected. The investigation entered the decisive phase, and the investigators were close to finally uncovering all the dark secrets that had been carefully hidden behind the walls of the Hearth Haven pension. Why did the family doctor prescribe strong medications for people who had not been alive for a long time? The investigation that had begun with found documents and a mass grave led the investigators to the office of the local family doctor, Dr. Helen Murray. Dr. Murray had been a district therapist for over 20 years and enjoyed an impeccable reputation. All the greater was Sheriff Michael Graves's surprise when it became clear that her name and signature were on dozens of prescription forms with prescriptions for strong medications for people whose remains had already been found on the pension grounds. In the doctor's office, the investigators confiscated a thick journal that was filled out in neat handwriting. In the journal, one and the same pattern clearly emerged. Every month, the pension owner of Hearth Haven personally came to Dr. Murray with a list of residents who, according to her statement, needed special care and palliative therapy. In almost all cases, the list contained the same names that had been discovered during the excavations in the pension's backyard. The expertise showed that the dosages of medications prescribed by Dr. Murray significantly exceeded the recommended medical norms. In some cases, the dose was almost double the maximum permitted. This caused even greater suspicions in the investigation. However, the facts of prescription issuance themselves contained no errors or gross violations. All documents were officially certified, and the patient's signatures on the prescriptions matched the passport data. Dr. Murray, questioned by the police, explained that she indeed prescribed medications for the pension residents. According to her words, she sincerely believed that all medications went exclusively to relieve the suffering of hopelessly ill people who were allegedly being provided palliative care. Furthermore, the The doctor emphasized that she always personally verified the patient's signatures against the passports that the pension owner regularly showed her. However, it turned out that when the investigation requested these documents from the doctor, Murray only provided ordinary photocopies of the passports, which lacked watermarks and other authenticity features. Now it was clear that the doctor might have been misled and the documents were forged. The investigation's first assumption was that Dr. Murray could have derived financial benefit from such a scheme. Immediately, a financial audit of her bank account and all personal assets was conducted. However, no unrecorded income or suspicious transfers were detected. The doctor lived modestly. Her financial situation remained absolutely transparent and legal. The corruption suspicions were not confirmed, but they did not completely stop harboring them. On the same day, other important documents became available to the police. These were receipts for the purchase of those medications that had been prescribed by Dr. Murray. These receipts had been paid with a personal check from the pension owner, which indicated her direct connection with the acquisition of medications. But the most unusual thing the investigators discovered was in the payment purpose column. There was an unusual formulation, garden solution. This detail instantly changed the direction of the investigation. Now there was direct evidence of the connection between powerful medical preparations and that yellow liquid that had recently been discovered in the drainage ditch of Farmer John Andrews. The investigators now turned their attention to the strange fertilizers that were prepared by the pension owner. For this, new requests were made and chemical expertises were ordered. It remained to clarify how exactly and in what form these preparations reached the soil in the backyard of Hearthaven. The forensic technicians had to definitively establish the connection between the substances found in the ditch and Dr. Murray's prescriptions. Dr. Helen Murray, although she remained only a witness in this phase of the investigation, was now involved in a grim story that could soon completely reveal the mechanism of the crime. While her role was still unclear, both the investigators and the doctor herself understood that the further investigation would definitely not be simple and would be difficult. The investigation that had begun as a financial crime was taking on more and more the features of a carefully constructed and cruel scheme with each new step, in which human lives had become only means for obtaining regular income. Now the investigators faced finding out how far the pension owner could have gone in her monstrous logic. How did the elderly woman physically manage the transport of remains to the pension's backyard? The investigation was rapidly moving toward conclusion. The investigators only had to establish some key details. One of them was the way the elderly Mary Ann Hughes, owner of the Hearthaven pension, could independently move heavy loads from the house to the flower beds and garden plots in the backyard. For a woman of her age, moving a weight of about 60 kilograms, moreover over a considerable distance, seemed almost impossible. And yet the traces pointed exactly to her. Neil Boston, the pension paramedic previously cleared of suspicions, gave the investigators new testimony. He reported that he had repeatedly noticed how the owner went out to the pension's backyard late at night, pushing a wheelchair in front of her, in which lay a voluminous and obviously heavy package covered with a top. Boston confessed that he asked no questions and attributed this to some household matters and tried not to interfere in the owner's affairs. This information was confirmed by the testimony of the neighbor from the adjacent property, the wife of Farmer John Andrews. She remembered that she had several times heard around 2 o'clock in the morning the distinct squeaking of wheels on the gravel path between the pension and the garden. However, the woman paid no special attention to this and thought the owner was simply tending her flowers and beds at night because of the daytime heat or her personal schedule. The investigators conducted a thorough examination of the pension grounds and devoted special attention to the route from the back entrance of the house to the flower beds and garden. The length of the route was exactly 18 meters with a small incline of about 3 degrees. The specialists concluded that even an elderly person could quite well have rolled a wheelchair with a load of the indicated weight along this route, since the physical effort was minimal, especially downhill. To confirm the hypothesis, the expert forensic technicians carefully examined the traces on the gravel path. The results were unambiguous. The wheel tracks completely matched the size and width of the wheels of the wheelchair that had been found in the shed on the pension grounds. Furthermore, The forensic technicians fixed particles of earth and dust from the wheelchair wheels that were identical to those that were located on the path between the house and flower bed. However, during the investigation initially, another hypothesis arose. The owner might have been helped by an accomplice who would have physically carried the heavy loads. The police officers checked this version specifically. Soil samples were taken, shoe prints were carefully examined, and an investigation of the property with the search dog was conducted. Not a single piece of evidence for the presence of a second person was discovered, which allowed the version about an accomplice carrier to be completely closed. The version about a possible accomplice was immediately discarded after the detailed analysis. The dogs discovered neither scent traces nor shoe prints of a foreign person. Everything indicated that the owner managed independently and only used the wheelchair and the terrain slope for her purposes. However, during an additional search of the shed, the investigators found something even more fascinating: an official bill from a local agricultural company for the delivery of 100 pounds of sodium nitrate, a powerful chemical substance that is commonly used in agriculture as fertilizer or compost accelerator. The receipt had also been paid by Mary Ann Hughes herself, and this substance was acquired regularly and in considerable quantities according to documents. This discovery immediately brought the investigation back to the previously established fact of the presence of sodium nitrate in the strange liquid that had flowed into the drainage ditch on Andrews's property. The investigators now had serious grounds to order a new expertise of the pension garden soil. The task of the specialists was to determine the exact concentration of sodium nitrate and other substances, to determine their origin, and most importantly, to confirm or refute the assumption that the owner's garden solution might actually have been part of a scheme for destroying remains. The pension owner, who earlier appeared completely inconspicuous like an elderly woman, now looked like a person who had carefully and coldly organized a complex and horrific system. Each new step of the investigation revealed her secrets in ever greater detail, and the detachment with which Mary Ann Hughes had acted all these years astonished even experienced investigators. The investigation was confidently approaching the finale, and the police officers knew that they only had left to connect all details accurately and definitively to end this grim chapter in the history of the small town of Lowell, and to officially present Mary Ann Hughes with accusations that were impossible to escape. Why did the social services not register the disappearance of the pension residents for so long? With the deepening of the investigation, it became obvious that serious gaps and inaccuracies existed in the system of recording the pension residents of Hearth Haven. These deficiencies obviously played into the hands of the owner, the 68-year-old Mary Ann Hughes, who for years successfully concealed the disappearance of her charges. Now the investigators faced finding out how she had managed to mislead the county social department. The investigators requested reports from the social department about inspections of the pension in recent years. The documents revealed a strange detail. Beginning with 2016, the number of residents remained unchanged and always amounted to 24 persons. No move-out or move-in was registered, although mass disappearances from 2017 to 2019 were now known. Particular attention of the investigators was drawn to the report of an inspection visit from the 10th of March 2019. The document was signed by an inspector. However, the photographs that are obligatory for such checks were missing. In the explanatory note, the inspector gave a strange reason: camera discharged, and confirmed the data by simply copying the names of the residents from the list that Mary Ann Hughes herself had provided. The investigation sent a new inspector for verification, who attentively compared the lists of residents for 2020 with the archives of previous years. It became clear that the names of the residents completely matched, and the birth dates were indicated very similarly, sometimes differing by only a few days. This could explain why the department employees did not notice the substitution. Visually, the lists looked credible. When the investigators summoned the former inspector for explanation, he admitted that he did not always personally verify the identities of the residents and trusted the lists that the owner provided orally and in writing. Additionally, it turned out that Mary Ann annually made a so-called donor gift amounting to $500 to the local church. of which this inspector was a member. This discovery led the investigation to think about a possible corruption connection. The investigators immediately began checking the bank accounts and financial operations of the former inspector, suspecting that the contributions to the church might have been a disguised form of bribery. But the audit of all his personal accounts and operations yielded a clear result. The donations actually went directly to the church's bank account and not personally to the inspector. The verification excluded the inspector's financial interest in the situation with the pension and definitively closed this false trail. However, on the same day, during an additional search of the pension owner's office, a notebook was found that could have completely changed the course of the investigation. Inside, the investigators discovered a detailed table that was divided into two main columns. The first column was designated with the letter D and contained clear dates that, as the investigators suspected, meant death days of the residents. The second column with the symbol recorded the sums of monthly receipts. The last entry in the table looked like this: 12/04-13 pers-9,870. The last entry in the table looked like this: 12/04-13 pers-9,870. Recorded the sum of monthly receipts. The last entry in the table looked like this: 12/04-13 pers-9,870. This discovery shocked even the most experienced investigators. In their hands were for the first time exact numbers and dates that confirmed the suspicions about the financial motives of the pension owner. The found notebook was urgently transferred to graphologists and document experts to definitively confirm the authorship of the entries. Now the investigation was rapidly approaching the moment when it would be proven that exactly Mary Ann Hughes maintained the entire record of deaths and corresponding monetary sums. The question of how the social services had overlooked the disappearance of the residents was practically solved. The lack of adequate control, trustfulness, and possibly negligence of the inspectors allowed the pension owner for almost 5 years to hide with impunity the true number of her charges and receive their social benefits. The investigation understood that the final uncovering of the crime mechanism was already near. It remained only to officially confirm that the owner acted not simply cynically, but consciously, documented her actions, and carefully kept records of the profits from her own victims. Now the investigation moved into the phase where the investigators had left to connect all evidence into a whole and confirm the accusations in court. How did sodium nitrate help the pension owner hide murders? The investigation, approaching the finale, now relied on strict scientific evidence. On the morning of the 1st of June, the results of the detailed analysis of the soil taken from the territory of the pension Hearth Haven were ready in the laboratory of the County Agricultural College. The experts, armed with the most modern chemical apparatus, confirmed the investigators' fears. The earth in the garden contained abnormally high concentrations of sodium nitrate that exceeded the permissible norm by 20 times. But that was not the only disturbing fact. The experts also established that significant amounts of barbiturates were present in the soil samples, which, mixing with sodium nitrate, formed a chemical composition with unique properties. According to the chemist's conclusion, this mixture not only accelerated decomposition processes of organic remains, but also effectively suppressed the specific odor, which helped the owner hide traces of the crimes from neighbors and inspectors. The investigators again invited Dr. Helen Murray for conversation, the family doctor who had already figured earlier in the investigation. The doctor admitted that exactly she had recommended Mary Ann Hughes to add sodium nitrate to the compost to accelerate its maturation. However, as Murray claimed, it was unknown to her what quantities of the substance the owner purchased. The doctor assured that her advice was a standard recommendation, typical for hobby gardeners. The police carefully checked Murray's bank accounts and accounting reports, striving to find out whether she had not received financial benefit for such recommendations. However, the audit showed the complete absence of money transfers or suspicious operations. All expenses for chemicals and preparations went exclusively through the accounts of the pension owner herself and confirmed the doctor's innocence in the financial schemes. Now the police's attention was completely directed at the pension owner. Marianne Hughes was summoned for renewed interrogation, where the investigators presented her with all available evidence: the high nitrate concentration, the chemist's conclusions, as well as her own receipts for purchasing these substances. This time Hughes did not begin to completely deny the obvious, but also did not admit direct guilt. During the conversation, she remained calm, and even allowed herself to dryly remark that the use of nitrate was completely ordinary practice for the garden. But then, unexpectedly and coldly smiling, she spoke a sentence that confused all those present for a moment. "Don't waste time. The meter is dripping anyway." The last potential false trail, the version about Dr. Murray's corruptibility, was definitively closed. Examinations and checks confirmed that the doctor had not received money from the owner, and her recommendations were exclusively professional and formal. The investigation recognized her as uninvolved and completely excluded her from the list of suspects. Nevertheless, Marianne's mysterious words about the meter that drips were interpreted by the investigation as an indirect confession that she was perfectly aware of and controlled every financial detail of her scheme. This phrase became the last drop that convinced Sheriff Michael Graves that before him stood a person who not only perfectly understood the consequences of their actions, but also stood coldly toward human destinies. On the evening of the same day, Sheriff Graves personally went to the pension Hearth Haven, where he officially presented Marianne Hughes with arrest warrant number 156/2020 on suspicion of committing a series of serious crimes and financial machinations. The woman was immediately taken to the station for further official procedures. Now the case completely moved to the legal level. Examinations, evidence, and witness statements came together into a unified, solid chain of facts that were ready to be presented in court. The investigators understood perfectly that a complex court trial lay ahead. However, they were certain Marianne Hughes no longer had a chance to escape responsibility. The owner's phrase about the meter was not only symbolic. The investigation carefully counted and recorded every piece of evidence, every document, and every word that the suspect had said. Now this time began to work against her herself. The investigation, which in the first phases appeared like the mysterious disappearance of a pension guest, grew into the biggest case of recent decades in the small town of Lowell, and forever changed the attitude of the locals toward the small pension on Maple Street. Maria, who had recently turned 13, was discovered in a swamp near the small town of Ibarra. According to preliminary conclusions of the investigation, she fell from the board of an An-2 aircraft from a height of approximately 10 kilometers, a preliminary figure, but shocking even for experienced experts. The strangest thing about this story: Maria survived, and it was precisely her rescue that drew attention to what was clearly a carefully thought out, almost perfectly planned crime without witnesses. But why was it necessary to complicate things so much and use an entire aircraft if it concerned a 13-year-old person? Investigators had to unravel a tangled chain of events that led from the swamps of Ibarra to hidden and much darker places. The first to arrive at the scene was an officer from the forensic group, a specialist in collecting and recording evidence. In the dense thickets of reeds, his attention was drawn to an object that should not have been there: an industrial-type plastic tie, neatly cut, as if someone was in a hurry to get rid of an unnecessary part. Such ties are widely used for securing cargo and fixing various parts in the aviation industry. At the household level, such an object is almost never encountered, especially here, on the remote Las Piñas swamp. The forensic specialist carefully records and packages the evidence. It is already clear it will be difficult to call Maria's fall accidental. The place where the tie was found is located exactly along the fall line calculated by experts. Here it becomes obvious. Someone hastily tried to hide the details of their plan to get rid of evidence. The next piece of evidence was found a little later. On Maria's outer clothing, a strong smell of TS-1 aviation kerosene was distinctly felt. This detail became key. It directly connected Maria with the An-2 aircraft, which is mainly used for small flights to hard-to-reach areas, often in the gray zone of the law. This aircraft was the perfect tool for such a crime. Simple, reliable, and invisible on radars. The only witness, a fisherman named Miguel Sanchez, gave testimony early in the morning when police officers arrived in the village. He said that around 2:14 at night he heard the noise of a small aircraft engine going in the direction of approximately 220 degrees by compass, southwest, directly toward the Las Piñas swamps. Sanchez noted that he rarely hears aircraft at night, especially at such a late time. However, he could not report any other details except the direction and time. But even this was enough to overlay his testimony on the map and confirm the flight route of the unknown aircraft. Immediately in the investigators' field of view was the owner of a small private airfield, a local farmer, long noticed in smuggling and small illegal transportation across the border. This man knew how to fly the An-2 and did it regularly. For now, investigators preferred to keep his name in the shadows, limiting themselves to cautious questions to local residents and observing the airfield from a distance. There was no official warrant yet, and scaring the suspect now would mean losing valuable evidence. The investigation also established that shortly before the incident, several local residents saw an old truck with an unknown person near the runway. The identity of this passenger remained unknown, but it was already clear. He played an important role in the case. The vehicle was located near the aircraft shortly before the estimated takeoff time. Where it disappeared later remained unclear. Immediately after the story became public, a local rural teacher came forward with loud accusations against a district criminal authority known by the nickname Lobo. The teacher claimed that Lobo allegedly engages in kidnapping local residents and sending them to remote jungles for some unknown purposes. However, after checking the information, the police could not find any confirmation of the teacher's words. No real facts and witnesses confirming these statements were found. The next morning, the forensic medical expert made an unexpected discovery. During Maria's examination, a small piece of aviation seal was found in her hair. The serial number of the seal turned out to be unique and did not match the numbers used by the local aero club. This small detail immediately became the most important evidence. Someone clearly did not plan that it would ever be found. The investigation sent an official request to the Regional Aviation Authority, demanding to provide lists of all aircraft that had access to the fuel base in Ibarra over the last 3 days. This is how investigators hoped to narrow the search circle and find out whose aircraft could have taken off that night. Now they were confidently moving towards solving what initially seemed like an impossible crime. Perfectly thought out, organized at altitude, where there could be no witnesses. And if Maria had not survived, this case would have remained just another unexplained incident somewhere on the distant outskirts of the province. At first glance, there was no logic in Oscar's actions. An ordinary farmer who had lived his whole life in a quiet village near Ibarra suddenly begins to take his old An-2 to maximum altitude for him at night. Who and why needed these strange night flights if the farmer did not even have official permission to fly? The investigation quickly revealed a curious fact in the suspect's biography. In Oscar's banking documents, recently obtained by official police request, a large money transfer amounting to $42,000 was recorded. The money came from an account registered in one of the offshore zones, and it arrived exactly 1.5 months before the described events. Neither the source nor the clear purpose of the transfer was indicated, but it was precisely after this date that Oscar began to regularly make night flights on his An-2, moreover, without any cargo or route registration. The flight log, which the pilot kept himself, contained suspicious gaps. Over the last 2 weeks, it recorded 3 flights, all at night, without accompanying documents and official permits. The flights were clearly performed in secrecy mode, which was already a serious violation of aviation rules in itself. During the initial interrogation, conducted in an informal format at the suspect's farm, Oscar remained confident and calm. To a direct question about the events of that night, he answered clearly and briefly. "At this time, I was processing the fields. I did not fly anywhere. This can be checked." It was precisely in this statement that the farmer made a mistake, not suspecting that the police already had data contradicting his words. The investigation had at its disposal satellite images obtained from the European Sentinel program, which recorded night routes of aircraft. It was precisely these images that clearly showed the silhouette of an aircraft that was moving toward the Las Piñas swamps exactly at 2:05 local time. Moreover, the navigation lights of the machine were turned off, which clearly excluded the possibility of simple agricultural work. The farmer clearly did not suspect the possibility of such control, and the police, having recorded the contradiction, decided not to reveal their cards for now, allowing Oscar to think that his alibi was still relevant. However, soon after the police visit to the farm, a new witness appeared, Oscar's neighbor named Carlos Mendez. He told investigators that on the evening before the incident, he heard a loud scandal in the pilot's house. Screaming and loud cursing continued for almost an hour. Carlos confidently stated that Oscar would not have flown anywhere after such a quarrel. Yes, after such scenes his hands usually shake, let alone pilot an aircraft. Investigators recorded Mendez's testimony but considered it doubtful. The neighbor's emotions could have been caused by personal dislike or a desire to distract attention from something else. After talking with Oscar and his neighbor, operatives, having received an official warrant, conducted an inspection of the An-2 aircraft itself, which was located on a private strip near the farm. Forensic specialists took a fuel scraping from the fuselage and sent it for urgent examination. The first results of the preliminary analysis confirmed the police's fears. The kerosene on the aircraft matched by type, TS1, and even by specific dye with the very one whose traces were found on Maria's outer clothing. This discovery meant one thing. The aircraft from which Maria was dropped almost certainly belonged to Oscar, although there was still insufficient evidence for an official charge. Despite weighty suspicions and evidence, the police decided not to arrest Oscar immediately. The aircraft was temporarily sealed and taken under surveillance, and covert control was established over the farmer himself. The authorities made it clear to local residents that the situation was under control, but in fact, law enforcement deliberately chose waiting tactics. It was necessary to wait for Oscar's next move. If he made a mistake, the police would react immediately. For local residents, this looked like inaction by the authorities. However, in fact, Oscar was being carefully watched. Every action of his, every step and phone conversation was now recorded and documented by the operational group. Investigators wanted to understand whether the night flights were Oscar's personal initiative or whether much more influential people stood behind him, whose interests extended far beyond farming and the local contraband market. So far, the investigation had confirmed facts: hidden night flights, transfer of a large sum of money from offshore, and obvious connection of the aircraft with the incident. But the main mystery, the motive and Oscar's own role in the carefully planned crime, still remained a puzzle, to the solution of which the investigation was slowly but confidently approaching. The night road through the outskirts of the village was deserted. Even at dusk, the locals tried to avoid it. But Ana Maria, for some reason, was walking there, alone, at such a late hour. Her mother claimed that Ana simply went out to check the livestock, but the truth turned out to be not so simple. When experts began to restore the data from her phone, an unexpected and disturbing episode from the girl's life was revealed. On the evening before the incident, at about 9:30, Ana Maria left the house, telling her mother that she was going to check the goats in a small pen on the edge of the village. Her mother's words were confident and did not raise doubts, but at the school where Ana studied, the police found something strange. The electronic diary used by teachers to record incidents contained a fresh entry with rather disturbing content. According to this entry, Ana Maria, the day before the incident, got into a conflict with one of her classmates and uttered a threat, which was recorded by the class teacher. The teacher, however, did not attach serious importance to this, attributing the episode to children's emotions. When detectives asked Anna Maria's parents questions about the girl's possible connection with the suspected pilot, the family categorically denied even the fact of their acquaintance. According to the mother, Anna had never been connected with strangers outside the village and especially could not have communicated with a person like Oscar. However, GPS data from Anna Maria's phone contradicted the family's words. According to the geolocation archive, the girl's phone was near the warehouse belonging to pilot Oscar on the evening of March 5th. The phone recorded her presence within a radius of about 30 meters from the object, which practically completely excluded an error in the data. The parents, however, continued to insist on their version, obviously not understanding how to explain these facts. Anna Maria's relative, her cousin named Diego, a man with a complex reputation and problems with the law, quickly came into the investigation's field of view. Investigators found out that recently it was Diego who regularly brought the girl to the outskirts of the village, according to him, for meetings with her father, who paid alimony to her mother in cash. It seemed that this explained the presence of the girl's phone near the pilot's warehouse. However, Diego had no alibi for the evening of the incident, and his testimony looked confused and unreliable. The police did not exclude him from the list of suspects, although they understood that Diego's motives were rather domestic and did not match the scale of the crime. Parallel to the work of investigators on the ground, forensic experts searched for clues in the immediate vicinity of the village. It was there, in a small river on the outskirts of the settlement, that Anna Maria's phone was found. The device was intact without external damage. The screen was not cracked and the case was preserved in good condition. This meant only one thing. The phone was drowned intentionally after previously removing the battery to prevent any further tracking and possibility of data recovery. It was this step that attracted police attention. An ordinary criminal, frightened of exposure, would have broken or destroyed the phone. But someone clearly wanted to preserve the device, leaving the possibility to return it later and dispose of it in another place. The investigation immediately sent the phone to the laboratory for recovery of the device's last activity. In the laboratory, forensic experts managed to restore the phone's log file quite quickly. The last outgoing record was short, only 3 words, sent shortly before Anna Maria's disappearance. She wrote a message to someone. "I saw everything." The recipient of the message remained unknown for now, but the text itself clearly indicated that Anna Maria had become a witness to something important, possibly exactly what they tried to eliminate her so cruelly for. Now investigators needed to understand what exactly Anna saw and to whom exactly this last message was intended. It was from this point that a new turn in the investigation began, connecting the girl, the pilot, and the people behind this whole story much more tightly than initially assumed. The investigation was already preparing to discard the version with external witnesses. Too high, too late, too deserted. But suddenly a person appeared claiming that he saw exactly what the investigators considered impossible. This new witness, fisherman Alejo, insisted. On that very night in the sky above the swamps, he clearly made out the silhouette of a person flashing against the background of the full moon. The police initially treated the testimony skeptically, but soon they had to change their opinion. Alejo Gomez, a 54-year-old local fisherman, spent almost every night on the water catching bait for sale. That night, he stood in a boat about 5 kilometers from the swamp, quietly and methodically collecting bloodworms. A small GoPro video camera was mounted in the boat, which he usually used to record the night catch. It was this camera that unexpectedly became key evidence when Alejo handed the recording over to the police. Reviewing the filmed material, experts noticed 2 bright, short flashes in the night sky. The flashes looked unusual and completely unlike the signal lights of commercial aircraft or other aircraft regularly flying over the region. At first, these shots puzzled the investigators. When Alejo was invited to give testimony, investigators directly asked if he could at least approximately describe the aircraft. The fisherman's answer was simple and clear, even to a person not versed in aviation. The aircraft was biplane. Similar to an old crop duster, such ones often fly here. I often see them, so I won't be mistaken. Such a description completely corresponded to an An-2 aircraft, which immediately returned the investigators' attention to pilot Oscar. Now Alejo's testimony looked much more convincing. During the same period, the police actively discussed the version involving drug trafficking passing through the region. The flashes in the GoPro footage at first glance resembled signal flares used by local couriers for nighttime contraband drops. The police even began to work out the possible connection of what happened with one of the regional drug cartels known for using aviation for their purposes. This distracted part of the investigative team, and attention temporarily switched to the cartel. Warehouses were checked, possible routes, and cargo drop points. However, the drug cartel version soon began to weaken. Checks did not reveal any movements or new routes that night. The false trail still remained on the version lists, but interest in it began to fade. The turning point in the investigation came when the recordings from the GoPro camera were sent for additional examination conducted using photogrammetry. After detailed analysis, it became completely clear that the flashes captured by Alejo's camera were not signal flares. These were brief flame bursts from the exhaust of an old piston engine, which are well known to aviation experts. The conclusion was unambiguous and supported by technical expertise. That night, an An-2 aircraft really flew over Las Piñas swamp. Alejo's version was confirmed down to the smallest details, including even the exact viewing angle of the camera, and now the police could no longer deny the obvious. The new discovery completely turned the course of the investigation around. If earlier the version about pilot Oscar's participation was just a hypothesis, now investigators received factual evidence. This meant that attention was returning to Oscar again, and he would have to answer completely different questions. Satellite data also allowed more accurate determination of the An-2 flight trajectory on the night of the incident. Route analysis showed that the altitude was significantly lower than the previously assumed 10 kilometers. The actual altitude was about 3.9 kilometers, which, however, did not reduce the seriousness of the situation, but forced the investigation to reconsider the initial assessments of the crime. Experts began to understand that this difference in altitude was also part of the plan. Probably the suspects deliberately inflated the altitude to confuse the investigation even more. Now it became clear that the entire scenario with the aircraft and altitude was carefully thought out to throw the police off the trail. While the police actively discussed further actions, witness Alejo remained under police protection, awaiting new calls for interrogation and understanding that his testimony could become decisive in the case. During the investigation, the police faced a paradoxical situation. Mario, the younger brother of the suspected pilot Oscar, was simultaneously spotted in two places far from each other. The investigators could not ignore this strange fact, especially considering Mario's reputation, a previously convicted person accustomed to hiding from law enforcement. Could the pilot's brother have somehow fabricated an almost perfect alibi to avoid responsibility for much more serious matters? Security cameras at a gas station on the highway leading to the airfield captured Mario's appearance at 23:48. He stopped there for just a couple of minutes, filled a canister with fuel, and immediately left. This location was only 10 kilometers from the runway where the An-2 aircraft was based, and from where Oscar presumably made the night flight. It seemed like an obvious and easily verifiable fact, but soon another piece of evidence appeared at the police station that caused serious confusion. One of the neighbors of a recently murdered local farmer, an elderly man named Pedro Ramirez, reported that on the same evening, at approximately 23:50, he saw Mario beating his neighbor with a hoe. Moreover, this event occurred 2 days before Ana Maria's disappearance, and therefore the investigators could not exclude a connection between these two crimes. Police experts urgently conducted a technical analysis of the recording from the gas station. They established that the time on the gas station camera could deviate by a maximum of 2 minutes. Such an error, while not critical, was sufficient to create a serious alibi. This meant that theoretically Mario could have managed to appear in both places if he acted very quickly. The investigators understood that Mario's alibi was shaky, but they could not officially refute it immediately. Meanwhile, Mario's lawyer immediately entered the case, loudly declaring in local media that the gas station recording was intentionally fabricated with the purpose of framing an innocent person. The defense attorney claimed that the police had long wanted to get rid of Oscar's problematic brother and now took advantage of a convenient opportunity. These statements quickly spread throughout the area, sowing doubts among local residents and even forcing the investigation to temporarily focus on additional verification of the video recording's authenticity. However, forensic experts quite soon confirmed the authenticity of the recording, and the false trail from the lawyer's side began to weaken. The police did not immediately dismiss it, but already stopped considering it the main direction of the investigation. The main breakthrough in the case happened unexpectedly when the gas station video was sent to experts again for deep audio analysis. And it was this audio analysis that revealed that in the background of the video, a distinct car horn signal could be heard, a sound that no one had noticed before. Experts immediately began studying the signal spectrum and compared it with the database of cars known to police and involved in the investigation. The result became a sensation. The signal on the recording belonged not to Mario's car but to his brother's pickup truck, Pilot Oscar's. Now a direct connection appeared in the case, indirectly indicating the brothers' participation in the same events, meaning their joint involvement in both crimes became much more likely. After this discovery, the police decided to combine two different cases, the brutal attack on the farmer and Anna Maria's kidnapping, into a single investigation. Now both brothers, Oscar and Mario, found themselves at the center of the investigation's attention simultaneously. Their actions and routes began to be studied as a single chain of events. At the same time, Mario himself still could not be found, and he continued to hide, clearly understanding that the situation had sharply changed, not in his favor. Investigators now confidently assumed that these cases might have involved another motive that remained unknown to the general public, and it was precisely this that became the cause of an entire series of crimes. But uncovering the true reasons for the brothers' actions was still far away. The investigation returned again to the figure of Pilot Oscar, now through the lens of his younger brother. And this turn in the case clearly threatened new, more sinister discoveries. But the police acted carefully, so as not to spook both suspects and not allow them to develop a new line of defense. Now Mario was officially listed among the persons wanted, and the police were preparing a large-scale operation for his arrest. Meanwhile, the question of how exactly the brothers could have become involved in such a convoluted story still remained without an official answer. But the investigators were confident. Soon everything would become absolutely clear to them. The investigation had already begun narrowing the circle of suspects, but a new detail forced them to return to Anna Maria's cousin, Ricardo. It was he who at the beginning of the investigation looked almost the most suspicious. But for some reason, the police had long not paid attention to the fact that his GPS tracker was cleared exactly on the day that coincided with the murder of the local farmer. What was the cousin hiding by destroying this data? The police called Ricardo for a repeat interrogation, now in an official capacity. The investigators were interested in a specific date, March 5th. It was on this day that the murder of Pilot Oscar and Mario's neighbor occurred. During the interrogation, Ricardo was nervous, clearly lost in his answers, but categorically denied his involvement in both Anna Maria's disappearance and the neighbor's death. In the end, he confessed to only one fact. He really did delete all the movement history for that very day, explaining it as an accident. Allegedly, the phone froze and he had to restart the device. However, investigators had already received the results of examining his motorcycle. On the handlebars, the tiniest drop of blood was found, the origin of which had not been understood until this moment. Initial tests excluded that the blood belonged to Anna Maria or the murdered neighbor. The police sent the sample for extended DNA analysis, the results of which were to become known very soon. To the question of why he regularly gave Anna Maria rides to the outskirts of the village, Ricardo confidently answered that he did this exclusively for her convenience. I just gave her rides to school." There was nothing else. To the question of whether someone could have used his motorcycle without his knowledge, Ricardo categorically denied such a possibility. However, investigators already knew more. One of the witnesses turned out to be a local mechanic who worked in a garage on the outskirts of the village. He told the police that he had seen Ricardo filling a small plastic canister with aviation kerosene several times, the very type of fuel that was found on Anna Maria's clothes and the fuselage of the AN-2 aircraft. It was at this moment that the police decided to carefully recheck the mechanic's testimony. The version that Ricardo could have been involved in some kind of aviation adventure or crime looked too obvious, and at the same time completely implausible. However, despite the apparent absurdity of this information, the mechanic looked convincing. Ricardo categorically denied that he had ever dealt with aviation fuel. This false trail required additional checks, diverting a significant part of the investigation's resources. But soon the results of the extended DNA analysis of the blood found on Anna Maria's cousin's motorcycle arrived. They shocked the investigative team and completely changed the direction of the investigation. The blood on the handlebars of the motorcycle that belonged to Ricardo turned out to be the blood of the wanted and hiding brother of the pilot, Mario P. How Mario's blood could have ended up on the victim's relative's motorcycle, this was a completely new line of investigation. Ricardo could not explain this fact in any way. He looked genuinely surprised, and the investigators intuitively understood that the cousin was unlikely to have been involved in the crime itself. Now the investigators began to suspect something completely different, that someone could have used Ricardo and his transport as an intermediate link in preparing for the crime. After receiving this important evidence, the police held an internal meeting. It was decided to temporarily remove suspicions from Anna Maria's cousin. He was officially freed from suspect status, but warned that if necessary, he could be called again. More important was something else. Mario's blood on the motorcycle meant that someone had actively used Ricardo's motorcycle for their own purposes. This opened a completely new perspective on events for the investigation. Now, the investigation began quickly discarding theories that had seemed logical in the early stages. The version of the cousin's direct complicity fell away. The version of his independent movements with fuel began to weaken, since a new and more realistic hypothesis emerged. Someone else could have transported fuel for the aircraft's night flight, presumably connected to Mario or Oscar himself. Thus, the investigation entered the next phase, where it gradually cleared itself of initial versions and concentrated on the key figures of the P brothers. The cousin was no longer the central suspect, and the police now concentrated efforts on searching for Mario and establishing the exact role he played in the convoluted story of kidnapping and murdering the neighbor. It became obvious to the investigators that the key to all events lay precisely in the motives and actions of two brothers, and Ricardo most likely turned out to be a random and uninformed figure in their complex game. The investigative team had already almost completely focused on searching for the suspected brothers when a new signal came from searchers working in the swampy area. In the high crown of a tree, at a height of 15 meters above the ground, a strange find was discovered. A neatly tied loop made from nylon strap 20 millimeters wide. The loop looked completely out of place, as if someone had specifically left it there, in plain sight, but at the same time out of reach. And the mystery lay not only in its origin, but also in the unusual properties of the material discovered by the laboratory. The loop was removed from the tree with great caution, carefully documenting its position. At first glance, the strap looked completely ordinary, dense, strong, typical for aviation use. But forensic experts immediately noted an unusual combination of details. First, the strap fibers were impregnated with liquid paraffin, which is used as lubricant for moving mechanisms of An-2 aircraft. This lubricant is not used for civilian purposes and clearly linked the found object to a specific type of aircraft. However, there was one fact that greatly surprised the experts. The strap lacked the characteristic smell of aviation kerosene, although all previously found evidence had been literally saturated with this fuel. Instead of kerosene, tiny particles of swamp spores were found in the fibers, which could have gotten there only after the loop had already appeared on the tree. This indicated that the strap appeared there after the incident and remained in place long enough to acquire signs of the local environment. The investigation put forward two versions. The first, the strap could have been used to secure cargo inside the aircraft and somehow ended up thrown outside. The second, less obvious, the strap was part of a parachute system. The latter version immediately raised doubts. No parachutes were listed on board the An-2, and no document confirmed their presence in Oscar's aircraft. Checks on both versions proceeded in parallel, but neither gave a definitive answer. Against the background of the investigation, the version connected with local drug cartels arose again. Someone suggested that the loop could have served to drop packages of drugs, a method that had already been recorded in the region before. Investigators sent the strap for additional examination to experts familiar with cartel operating methods. The experts quickly concluded that this type of strap had never been used by local drug couriers. The version was officially excluded, and police finally closed this line of investigation. The key breakthrough occurred when forensic experts carefully examined the loop for fingerprints. After many hours of analysis, they managed to isolate a single, clear fingerprint. When it was compared with databases, it turned out that the fingerprint belonged to a person already known to the investigation. It turned out to be the pilot's assistant, who until now had not officially figured in the investigation. The fact of his involvement was new and extremely important. Now the investigation had another figure directly connected to the aircraft and the events of that night. The discovery of the pilot assistant's fingerprint instantly gave new momentum to the investigation. Police immediately requested an official search warrant for his house, hoping to find additional evidence or understand his exact role in this crime. While documents were being prepared, investigators began building a new version of events in which the pilot assistant could play a much more significant role than previously assumed. The loop turned out to be the most important piece of physical evidence that finally linked all the threads of the story together. The An-2 aircraft, pilot Oscar, his brother Mario, and now also a third person, the pilot assistant, whose participation was clearly not accidental. The investigation entered a new phase. Now police were one step closer to establishing the complete picture of events of that fateful night. The assistant himself had not yet been detained, and police deliberately kept him in the dark, awaiting the results of the search. An atmosphere of hidden expectation still surrounded the investigation. It seemed that now investigators knew exactly where to go next, and were ready to take the next decisive step. Meanwhile, the drug cartel version was finally discarded. The strap loop became the link that officially excluded this line from the list of versions, clearing the investigation space of unnecessary noise and excess distractions. Now attention was completely focused on the pilot assistant, whose house they were already preparing to search. The arrest of Diego, the pilot assistant, became a real breakthrough in the investigation. In the first minutes of interrogation, investigators noticed a strange bruise on his sternum that clearly repeated the shape and size of the metal handrail on the door of the An-2 aircraft. But Diego himself insisted on a completely different cause of his injury. And investigators had to find real evidence of his involvement in the events of that night, not relying only on suspicions. Police promptly requested Diego's medical documents. According to the medical record that investigators received from the local clinic, he had sought help on the 8th of March, a day after the events. The doctor recorded a sternum injury, and Diego himself then explained it as a domestic accident. Allegedly fell from a stepladder in the garage. At that time, no one paid attention to this fact. Now investigators knew precisely that such an injury was typical for a person who was in the cabin of an An-2 at the moment of a sharp maneuver. Simultaneously with the medical documents, police gained access to Diego's phone. On the screen, operatives saw a message sent from his phone at 3:10 in the morning on the 7th of March, just 1 hour after Ana Maria was dropped from the aircraft. The message contained only the words, "Did as you asked, money." The recipient of the message remained unknown for now, but the connection to money immediately reminded investigators of the large sum received by pilot Oscar. During interrogation, Diego was confident and restrained, insisted that he was just a mechanic, and categorically denied that he had ever taken to the air in an aircraft. When asked directly about the injury, he again repeated the stepladder story, although nervousness in his voice was already noticeable. Investigators understood that Diego's lies were already on the verge of exposure, but the investigation was temporarily complicated by Diego's lawyer, who immediately declared that his client could not physically have been on board the aircraft. He presented to the investigation a receipt for Diego starting a warehouse guard shift at 2:30 in the morning on the 7th of March. At this moment, warehouse surveillance cameras were turned off due to a technical failure, which provided a small but important alibi for the suspect. Investigators were forced to temporarily step back and check this version, but the receipt looked genuine, and so far nothing suggested otherwise. The turning point in the case happened when one of the police investigators, rechecking materials from Diego's phone, accidentally discovered a deleted photograph that technical expertise was able to restore. The image clearly showed the cabin of an An-2 aircraft during flight. The date and time in the XEF file of the photograph left no doubt. The picture was taken on the 7th of March, exactly at 2:04 in the morning, literally 10 minutes before the incident with Ana Maria. Now, Diego's alibi finally collapsed. Realizing that all evidence was against him, Diego agreed to give his first confession. He began carefully, cautiously choosing words, trying to minimize his role, but now his testimony connected the entire chain of events of that night. During preliminary interrogation, he first directly mentioned the names of pilot Oscar and his brother Mario, although he still avoided detailed explanations of their role. To the question about what exactly he did at the request of the message sender, Diego answered briefly, almost without looking the investigator in the eye. "I just untied the rope." Police immediately understood that this was the very strap found later in the tree crown. Now it was clear. Diego was directly on board the aircraft at the moment of committing the crime, and most likely he performed the key action that ensured Ana Maria's ejection from the aircraft. The investigation immediately began working through this new information, comparing Diego's words with flight data. According to calculations by aviation experts, the An-2 route that night took approximately 18 minutes. This time was sufficient to complete a flight of 70 kilometers from the airfield to the drop site and return back, which fully corresponded to witness testimony and camera recordings. Now police possessed irrefutable testimony from a direct participant in the crime. Diego himself gradually realized that he no longer had room for maneuvers and began demonstrating readiness to cooperate with the investigation. Although motives and details still remained unknown, it became clear that Diego was one of the most important links in the criminal chain connecting two brothers and the An-2 aircraft. The police immediately sent out arrest warrants for Oscar and Mario, although the whereabouts of the latter remained unknown. The investigation finally approached solving what seemed like a completely senseless and inexplicable incident. From the very beginning of the investigation, a local criminal authority known as Don E appeared in the police's field of vision. A teacher from the village, disturbed by the incident, was the first to point to him, claiming that he had seen Don E threatening people. The police initially considered this version doubtful, but persistent rumors forced them to conduct a thorough check. Could an influential person, accustomed to solving problems through force, have ordered such a brutal elimination of a witness? The investigation began with a simple but effective method: establishing an alibi. The check revealed that on the evening and night of March 7th, when the crime occurred, Donnie was at the annual carnival in the center of Ibarra. This event was thoroughly documented by numerous surveillance cameras. Recordings from 4 different cameras allowed the police to confirm that Donnie was indeed at the carnival from 8 in the evening until 3 in the morning, and did not leave this place for a minute. Additionally, the police gained access to his financial documents, bank accounts, and internal reports. Specialists carefully checked every transaction over recent months and found not a single payment that could be connected to pilot Oscar or his brother Mario. No transfers, no suspicious contacts or hints of the criminal leader's involvement in the case were found. The investigators returned to the teacher who had previously claimed to have seen threats from Don E. During the repeated interrogation, the teacher appeared confused and admitted that he had probably made a mistake. He explained that it was very dark that evening, and his assumption was based more on fear and Don E's reputation rather than actual facts. These admissions completely destroyed the initial version of accusations against the criminal authority. Given the seriousness of the accusations, the prosecutor's office officially examined the materials collected by the police. Soon, the prosecutor personally issued a ruling stating that the case completely lacked evidence of criminal activity regarding Don E. Doubts about his involvement were officially removed, and this line of investigation was closed forever. Now, the investigation could no longer waste time and resources checking a version that initially seemed unlikely but was necessary to eliminate any public resonance. Parallel to closing Don E.'s version, experts completed analysis of financial flows connected to the offshore payment of $42,000 that arrived in Oscar's account a month before the incident. This sum had long caused suspicions of third-party involvement, such as Don E., however. A detailed financial audit established that the funds were cashed through an offshore company that had no relation to the criminal authority. Instead, a clear connection was documented between the shell company and a firm directly owned by the P brothers. Now it became finally clear to the investigation that the money was received and cashed by the brothers themselves, and there were no third parties in the payment chain. After closing the version with Don E., the investigation's focus completely shifted back to the brothers, Oscar and Mario. The police again began intensive searches for Mario, who continued to hide from justice. Now the investigators were finally convinced that the crime was conceived and implemented by a narrow circle of people directly connected to each other. The prosecutor gave orders to officially mark the version involving the criminal authority as closed and ordered the acceleration of all activities for finding and arresting the brothers. Now, all attention of the operatives was focused on Mario's figure, who remained a key missing link in the case. Finding him became a priority task, and the investigation was preparing to take a decisive step in the coming days. Thus, the investigation finally rid itself of unnecessary and erroneous versions that had previously taken precious time. Now, before the police was a clear path, confirmed by evidence, leading to the P brothers and their assistant Diego, already detained and having given first testimony. Closing the version with the criminal authority allowed the police to publicly report progress and narrow the search field, while simultaneously increasing pressure on Mario, who undoubtedly now knew that time for escape or hiding evidence was almost gone. The investigation was confident that the case was approaching its logical conclusion, and it was only a matter of the coming days. From the very beginning of the investigation, the main mystery remained the altitude from which Anna Maria was dropped. The figure of 10 kilometers seemed not only implausible, but practically unrealistic for an An-2 type aircraft. Now, thanks to an unexpected find in the aircraft cabin, the possibility appeared to establish the exact altitude and completely destroy the myth that arose in the first days after the incident. During a repeated inspection of the An-2 aircraft cabin, the investigative team discovered an unusual device, a homemade altimeter based on an ordinary smartphone installed on the instrument panel. The device continuously recorded barometric data and sent it to cloud storage linked to pilot Oscar's personal account. Investigators quickly obtained official access to this cloud and extracted a log file containing records of the flight that very night. Experts immediately studied the obtained data and established that the maximum flight altitude was only 4,400 meters, not the notorious 10,000. This figure completely matched other previously obtained evidence and finally confirmed the technical possibility of survival when falling from such an altitude. The pilot's defense immediately tried to cast doubt on this data, claiming that the log file could have been forged or altered by the investigation. However, technical expertise immediately refuted this version. The hash checksum of files from the smartphone and cloud storage was identical. Any changes were completely excluded, and the investigation could use the data as absolute proof. At this same moment, another attempt was made to confuse the investigation. A version was thrown into public space that Anna Maria was dropped later, after reaching a greater altitude. But even this version was quickly refuted. The photo from assistant pilot Diego's phone had a precise timestamp, 2:04, and at this moment the flight altitude was 4,350 meters. This completely matched the barometric altimeter data and other evidence. The false trail was instantly discarded. However, studying the log file further, investigators made another important discovery. It turned out that the same file contained records from several days before the incident. On the night of March 5th, the aircraft made several circles directly over the farm of pilot Oscar's neighbor, the same one who was later found murdered. The coordinates of this circle were clearly recorded by the device, which for the first time connected the aircraft and its crew to another crime committed shortly before the events with Anna Maria. Now the investigation possessed direct technical proof that the aircraft actively participated in another incident, which forced a different view of the suspect's motives and actions. This discovery accelerated the process of issuing an arrest warrant for Mario, who had remained on the run all this time. His whereabouts were established thanks to border services when he tried to cross the border with Colombia. The arrest proceeded quickly and without complications. Now the investigation had all three defendants: pilot Oscar, assistant Diego, who had already given testimony, and the hiding brother Mario. Investigators completely removed the myth of 10 kilometers, recognizing this figure as merely the result of erroneous first testimony and rumors. The investigation now had irrefutable proof that the actual drop altitude was slightly more than 4 kilometers, and technical data completely confirmed all details told by witnesses and suspects. Now the investigation entered the final stretch. Evidence clearly converged, motives began to gain clarity, and investigators no longer had doubts about who was behind this crime. Only one thing remained: to force the suspects to tell what exactly motivated them to commit such a cruel and carefully planned act. The final stage of the investigation was to finally reveal all remaining mysteries, including the reasons for that strange night flight over the farm, and connect the neighbor's murder with subsequent events. The investigation had enough facts to present a complete and convincing picture of what happened in court, and the prosecutor's office was preparing an indictment that was to close one of the most confusing cases in the region in recent years. Now the main thing was done. All suspects were under police control, and the altitude from which Anna Maria was dropped became no longer a mystery, but a confirmed fact that made it clear that survival was possible, and there was no miracle involved. This was pure luck and chance that allowed the crime to be solved and the guilty to be punished. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place exactly at the moment when the coordinates of the airplane route, obtained from the barometric log, appeared on the projector screen installed in the courtroom. The courtroom fell silent. On the faces of the defendants, it could be read that they already knew the outcome. In reality, the story did not begin on the night of March 7th, but 2 days earlier. Everything started with a petty dispute about land. The neighbor of pilot Oscar and his brother Mario refused to yield part of the pasture, valued at almost $100,000. It seemed like an ordinary conflict of rural residents, but it was precisely that night, when traces of struggle were found on the neighbor's land, that everything became irreversible. Anna Maria accidentally became a witness to this incident. That evening, March 5th at 9:45, a short recording appeared on her phone. "I saw everything." She did not understand that this phrase would trigger a chain of events that would forever change her life. But she knew to whom she was sending the message. It was the only person she trusted and who, unfortunately, could not protect her. Mario quickly understood what threatened him. Then he called his brother Oscar, explained the situation, and proposed a deal. If the witness disappeared, they would be able to take the neighbor's pasture. Oscar did not refuse. Moreover, He had already received an advance payment of $42,000 to his offshore account, part of which was intended for buying an airplane, and the other part was his personal profit. The money seemed too attractive to refuse. Oscar did not carry this out personally. He entrusted the matter to his trusted mechanic, Diego, promising him $8,000. The scenario was simple and cynical. Capture the witness, deliver her to the airfield, take off, and then get rid of the problem in such a way that no traces would remain. Physical evidence in the airplane confirmed the participation of all three. In the cabin of the Anne II, there remained traces of kerosene and biological traces of Ana Maria. Altimeter recordings, supported by EXIF data from photographs, confirmed that the drop occurred at an altitude of 4,350 meters. This completely destroyed the legend of a 10-kilometer fall and explained how Ana Maria could survive. The phone found in the river finally confirmed her status as an unwanted witness. However, in court, Mario tried to completely shift the blame onto his brother, claiming that he did not participate in organizing the kidnapping. But his words were quickly refuted. The pilot's assistant, Diego, during the confrontation presented a voice recording that he had made himself. On it, Mario's voice could be clearly heard. "Just throw her like a sack." This was the final touch that put an end to the question of responsibility. The court's verdict sounded cold and brief. All three received lengthy prison sentences. At this moment, silence arose in the hall. Ana Maria slowly rose from the bench, leaning on crutches, and headed toward the exit. Reporters did not take their eyes off her, recording every movement. Behind her, on the defendant's bench, there remained an empty place that had previously been occupied by relatives of the accused. They left without saying a word to the press. The family preferred to remain in the shadows. This was the final and irrevocable closure of the case. No more questions were heard in the courtroom. All details, all evidence, all motives were clearly presented and recognized by the court. The crime turned out to be banal, simple, and senselessly cruel. Land, money, fear of losing freedom. However, two undisclosed lines remained in the case, which were classified and to which there is no longer access. The first is the participation of an unknown accountant from an offshore company who transferred money through the brothers' accounts. The second is the possible awareness and tacit consent of other family members of Oscar and Mario. These details will forever remain in the prosecutor's archives, closed from public access. When the bailiffs led away the defendants and the press left the hall, only the last frame remained, the silent gaze of the investigator closing the folder with the inscription, "Case Number." The remaining details will obviously forever remain under lock and key, in folders accessible only to those who know more than others. The story is completed. It left no questions, only dry facts presented as accurately as possible. Ana Maria is alive. Her testimony helped restore the picture of events, but now she has to live on, knowing how close she came to the edge of the abyss. The lights went out in the courtroom, and the doors closed. Everything that could be said has already been said. The rest will remain in those archives to which access is permitted only to a few. In the end, truth is only what they were able to prove.